In one of my live streams, not the last one, but the one before, the one in which Peter, you took a little bit of objection to my term "missing" in my thumbnail. Um, I didn't change it. I'm doubling down. I'm doubling down.
So this is revenge now. All right. Go
Yeah, it's
ahead.
revenge. Revenge. No. So we took a look at Mark 11:26, and the verse in question is talking about forgiveness. Essentially, it's if you don't forgive those who sinned against you, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. It's that part. Neither will your Father forgive you. I'm just paraphrasing here.
Hmm.
But I want to read to you what Metzger says in his commentary about this, because this really does fit into our discussion of text types. So he says, although it might be thought that the sentence was accidentally omitted because of homoteleuton, its absence from early witnesses that represent all text types make it highly probable that the words were inserted by copyists in imitation of Matthew 6:15. So he's not using the lingo that it's a harmonization with Matthew. The NET doesn't use that word either in its notes. It calls it an assimilation because it's not. It's just not the same. And I
Yeah.
think most of
Right.
us would agree with that. The question here, though, is that Metzger is preferring the argument of early manuscripts of all text types over homoteleuton. So
Hmm.
he's seeing the early references to text that you probably know where I'm going with this.
Hmm.
So if we're beginning to talk about the fading away of text types as we've known them, would that not push this textual variant in favor of retaining the longer reading, because homoteleuton would now bump up in its strength as a explanation for this variant?
Yes. Next
So
question.
so so you would include this verse?
I would think so. I can say a couple things. Well, first of all, I've only looked at this like, you know, this morning. Okay, so keep that in
Okay,
mind.
sure.
Um, I'm just looking at the ECM to see what they did. They put it in double brackets.
Yes.
So I don't know
You
what the
see,
Nestle 29 will do. Yeah, I had thought to check what they do. It's omitted in some weighty manuscripts like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. I think it's fair to
right.
say that the Nestle 27, okay, not the
Yeah.
28, but the 27, I think it's fair to say there's a definite pattern that I've noticed over the years.
Mhm.
I've not like tallied all these, but where they are really hesitant to go against agreements of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So like it's very rare where like the text of the Nestle 27 is a text not found in both those manuscripts where they agree. Now where they disagree, it's a different story, right? That's a different
Right.
ballgame. But so I think there's a bit of that going on here. In terms of Metzger's specific argument, its absence from early witnesses that represent all text types makes it highly probable that the words were inserted by copyists and imitation. I'm not sure there's any part of that argument I find plausible.
Right. Right.
I have
Uh,
problems with all of that, but yes, certainly on the text type front. And that I think would be a great example of what I said earlier. Why have we liked text types? Because they have helped us make specific textual decisions. This is a great example, and this is an example where I think we should not use them to make a textual decision.
Interesting. I wasn't expecting that
Sorry.
from
Yeah, I wasn't either.
you.
Because honestly, I didn't watch your videos, so I should just apologize. I was totally trolling you in my comment. I mean, I still don't like this language of like why are verses missing because I think it prejudges the whole issue.
Yeah.
Nobody's
Sure.
ever asked
Sure.
me, for example, why does the King James add this verse, right? Even though it does, the King James Bible does add verses, okay,
Right.
that are not found in early
Yeah. Now
manuscripts.
I'm
So
not a King James
add it.
onlyist,
No, I
right?
know. I'm just
So
saying. I'm
yeah.
just saying nobody's ever in my lifetime ever asked me, Dr. Gurry, how come my King James adds this verse that my NIV doesn't have? It always goes the other direction.
Well,
Okay.
in all fairness, though, right? I think what we see between the King James version and its underlying text, the Textus Receptus, is
Mhm.
it typically is longer. In fact,
Oh, of course. Yeah, of
objectively is
course.
longer. So we're going
Yeah,
to see.
objectively. Yeah.
Yeah,
Now there's some
yeah.
exceptions, I could show you some
Yes,
interesting
I found
exceptions.
one the other day.
Yeah.
I was thinking
Yeah.
about doing something
But
with
you're
it,
right
but
as a whole. And this goes, so I've written a blog post called, I don't know what it's called, but basically on this question of textual FOMO, fear of missing out.
mm, yeah, I remember that one. Yeah.
Right. And I think this touches on it because nobody's ever, like I say to people, like, go to the end of Revelation, right? It has a warning against both adding or taking away from what is written. Yes. And yet I find that Christians are almost never that afraid of things being added to the Bible.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
there's this sort of innate strong discomfort with this fear that something might have been taken out.
Right.
But the idea that something might have been added that doesn't belong there does not seem to bother them as much. And I don't know why that is, honestly, because Revelation seems to treat both equally as bad. So
Right.
if the King James has added something, I guess is my point, that should be just as bad as if the NIV has taken something else out. But people seem to only be worried about the one, and I don't know why. Well, I do know why that is, but we don't need to get into it.
Right.
Anyways,
Right.
back to Mark 11:26. No, I think
Yes.
Metzger's sentence. Here's what Metzger should have said. And again, this is a bit off the cuff. Okay, so forgive my irreverence.
Mm-hmm.
He should have said, "It could be thought that the sentence was accidentally omitted because of homoiotoluton, and that's the best explanation." Period. Now, he could have gone on to say, "It's surprising to find it missing in so many early important manuscripts. However, we know that homoiotoluton is a very easy mistake to make and affects even the best scribes and the best manuscripts from time to time. Therefore, that explains why it is missing in these early important witnesses, which otherwise are very good manuscripts." Does that make sense? That's how I would write the note.
That's good.
And then I would include this verse probably again. This is off the cuff, so I shouldn't pin myself too much here. But I've written, if listeners want to know, I've written an article raising questions, challenging challenging people to take seriously the mistake of homoiotoluton, and saying we should take it more seriously because it happens more than we think. And where there's an easy explanation of a shorter reading as due to homoiotoluton, we should absolutely prefer the longer reading. This is, in my opinion, a perfect example. Okay, in the article I wrote, I only used Matthew examples, so I didn't touch on this one. But you have the repetition of humon. To me, this is a perfect example of homoiotoluton.
Right.
So yes, let's prefer the longer reading. And you add to that, okay, if I haven't had time to look up the Matthew parallel, but if it's not a verbatim parallel, that only strengthens the case to prefer the longer reading here in Mark.
Right. Yeah, there's different clauses, like who is in heaven is in Matthew 6:15 and a couple other phrases. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So all I heard was, Dwayne, you're right. And I've been mispronouncing homoiotoluton.
Oh, okay. That may be. I don't know about that. I don't know. Who knows how to pronounce it?
Yeah. I don't know. All right. So, Dr. Robinson, I'm going to put the floor over to you. And do you have anything to add to Dr. Gurry's brief? Not total. He hasn't written on, not entirely committed, but committed reference to Mark 11:26.
I'm going to give him a gold star for his forehead for agreeing with me on this verse, but I also would not say it's missing, just to clarify.
Sure.
It's either included or excluded. Take it that way. It's either the longer reading or the shorter reading. That's descriptive without biasing the decision. But nevertheless, if Metzger can be falsified when he's starting to claim representatives of all text types omit that or do not have that last part of the discussion there. The whole verse is absent, and he says it's manuscripts representing all text types. Did he ever look at the manuscripts that contain it? And this falsifies Metzger's whole claim. I'm looking at the UBS, which gives you a little bit more information, but you have D, Western manuscript, Theta, which may be Caesarean, who knows, Family 1, Family 13, 28, may be Caesarean, 33, which is usually Alexandrian, 579, which is usually Alexandrian, 1071, which is usually Western, 1241, which is usually Alexandrian, along with the Byzantine. So you've got representatives of all the presumed text types are supporting the inclusion of it. Metzger didn't have to mention that. And it's showing that there was a probably anti-Byzantine bias, which tilted the way that he would explain how some of these verses should be regarded. Of course, he has to defend the reading of the UBS Nestle-Aland text. That's what his textual commentary was about. But I believe in this case, he deliberately ignored part of the evidence that would have been contrary to his position. And it then if you remove that, it leads you back right to the homoteleuton issue. And that seems to be the one and only good explanation for it. And I don't see the parallel in supposed parallel in Mark 6:15 is doing much for it at all, because it's dealing with the same subject, but it's different. And also in Mark 6:15, you've got some manuscripts that actually omit the words anthropos or taparpatoma auton in the earlier part of the verse, but you don't have any manuscripts listed that omit the last clause, which would be the closest parallel, if they did, to what's going on in Mark 11:26. So I don't see the Matthew 16:5 is really contributing anything to say this is a harmonization, assimilation, or parallel, or anything like that. So again, I think homoteleuton is the simple explanation. It's the one that should be followed.
Great.
Agreed. Dwayne, can I chime in and add something? I pulled out my ECM again. I think this is probably worth adding.
Yeah.
And this is one of those places where if you're only using the Nestle-Aland apparatus, it's unfortunate because you may be missing stuff that's actually important. We don't have the ECM for everywhere, so we got to make do with what we have. But the ECM has about a dozen or so manuscripts that actually go on to add even more text to this verse. Okay. Coming from looks like from Matthew 7:7-8, or Luke 11:9-10, which is, I say to you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open, etc. Okay. That's a long addition. Okay.
Yes.
It looks to me like nobody thinks that longer reading is original.
Right.
So while Metzger, I think, is wrong that verse 26, as we have it in our English Bibles, is due to influence by Matthew 6:15, it does look to me very clear that scribes have added text from the other synoptic gospels at this point in the text. It's just not what we know as Mark 11:26.
Right.
But I'm looking at the ECM, and about 12 manuscripts or so have this much longer reading where you get all this other stuff about, ask and it will be open, seek and you will find. It's very clear that scribes do harmonize gospel texts, and that it actually almost certainly did happen at precisely this point in the text. However, what we know as verse 26 that's not what explains that. Does that make sense? So this case is actually somewhat interesting in that I would argue with Metzger that harmonization has happened at this point in the text, and scribes have added to this verse from the other gospels, but it is not what we know as verse 26. And Maurice would agree with this, I assume, because this longer reading that's in the ECM is not in the Byzantine text.
These other longer readings are very clear examples of scribal harmonization. And the most important thing is they are so limited in the number of manuscripts that support them. You might call at that point that those that are adding that, let's say, I don't know how many you have that are doing that. Let's say it's a dozen. They are so limited, and it's showing maybe they are deriving from a common archetype, but they're not one that would pertain to any of the so-called major clusters like Alexandrian, Western, Caesarean. These are just independent harmonizations, and that type of harmonization occurs all over the place among manuscripts of the Gospels. Wherever there's possible parallels, you can almost bet some manuscript will pull it out and do it in his own copy, probably because of what he's remembering from something he read somewhere, and he's thinking, well, it must belong here too.
And this is okay. So Dwayne, this gets back to the why don't. Now I'm going to pick on you again. Okay.
Yeah. Go for it. Go for it.
But this gets to why I don't like this language of missing, because I could look at you and say, Dwayne, your King James Bible. Let's say I looked at this longer reading, okay, that talks about seek and you will find, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find. Okay.
Yeah.
I could say, let's call that verse 26a. I'm going to make up a verse number for it because all verse numbers are made up.
Right.
I'm going to make up a verse number, call this verse 26a. I can now look at your King James Bible and say, Dwayne, why is your Bible missing
adding
26a?
Right.
You see? And my point is to say everybody's Bible is missing something. All Bibles in comparison to certain other Bibles,
Sure.
all manuscripts in comparison to other manuscripts are missing something that other manuscripts have. The question is, are they missing the right things? Now, on what we call Mark 11:26, I would say my Nestle Lawn 27 is missing something that I think probably should be there, that belongs there, that Mark wrote.
Right.
But I would not say that this longer reading that is clearly in a dozen or so manuscripts, I would not say that's missing from anybody's Bible. Although, objectively speaking, it is missing.
Right.
Right? It is, because it's right here. It's in my ECM. So I could say, it's missing from your Nestle Lawn. It's missing from Maurice's Byzantine text. But I think it should be missing from there.
Right.
It doesn't, because it doesn't belong there, you see. So that's why I don't love the language of missing. It's just because it prejudges the issue, and it gets people. I think it just obscures the real issue, and makes people think that there are Bibles that aren't missing anything, when in fact every Bible is missing something that's in some other Bible out there. There's no Bible that isn't missing something.
Yeah, and I mean there's a recognition, right? Now, I'm going to defend my use of the term missing.
Do it.
No, but there's a recognition that the text types. Here I am, text type brain. The textual variants that we often talk about are either in the margins or in the body of the text. So in that sense, they're not missing at all. But what's interesting is the way that modern English Bibles now typically handle entire verses, which is just to take the verse number out entirely. So it skips over from 25 to 26. 25 to 27 in this. And I mean, it's understandable if you think that passage is not scripture and it's a whole verse. I mean, what else are you going to do? Just have a number there with nothing there. I mean, I think the NIV did that they put the number there, but put just the number in square brackets and then went on to verse 20. I mean, there's a certain pragmatic requirement, right? And I get that. But yeah, in using the term missing, I think most people who don't see the verse there would say, why is verse 27 missing? So that's my justification for using the term missing.
I get it.
All right, so let's move on. That was I really enjoyed it. That was a really good synopsis. Maybe it was because I was right, but no. Yeah. So let's move on. Let's finish up here. The last question I have here. So, what happens to text types now? Like, what's the future of text types? And let's start with Dr. Gurry, and we'll give Dr. Robinson the last word.
What I would hope would happen with text types is they sort of ride off into the sunset and have a nice retirement. Enjoy their years in exile. I think we should do away with them. Like I said, I don't teach them to my students. The Tyndale House edition Greek New Testament is an entire Greek New Testament that does not appeal to them. So I think what we need to do is people need to get away from this idea that we can't do text criticism without them. And so what I hope replaces them? What I hope replaces them is greater awareness of actual manuscripts and of the kind of mistakes that scribes tend to make. So maybe if I could put it this way, a greater emphasis on internal evidence and maybe a greater sensitivity to it. That's certainly what I can just say happened in my own case. I didn't go out looking to, reject the concept of text types. I've certainly taught them. They made sense to me. I found them useful as a student. But as I spent years of my PhD working through a large apparatus like the ECM, one of the things that does for you is make you aware of how many variants don't get into your Nestle Aland apparatus. And one of the things that gets left out is a lot of kind of the boring variants, but that are actually like the most common ones. And so unfortunately, I can give you kind of a skewed picture of the kind of mistakes that scribes tend to make. And in working with the ECM apparatus, I hope that what happened is I became more sensitive to the common mistakes that scribes make. And that actually boosted my confidence then in using internal evidence to make decisions and not feel like I had to rely on something like text types. Now, do I still use external evidence? Of course I do. I still consider the manuscripts that attest a given reading, absolutely. But in a case like what you saw with Mark 11:26, in the past, when I was a student, I would have never been comfortable going against the evidence of Sinaiticus Vaticanus, like I just did. But after having worked with a large apparatus now, I can easily say, no, homoiotoluton is a super easy mistake to make. It's easy to make without noticing that you've made it, okay? And it happens to everybody. So the fact that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus agree in this omission is not startling to me. It's a homoiotoluton. Whether they both made the same mistake independently, or whether they have some kind of shared ancestor that they both go back to, with however many intermediaries between, I don't know, but I don't actually need to know that to make a judgment at this point and just say, no, this reading is easily explained by homoiotoluton. That's by far the simplest explanation. Let's go with that. And the fact that that happens to mean that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus come out a little less pristine than they did before, okay, that's fine to me. I'm not I'm not interested in thinking that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are somehow perfect manuscripts. They are most certainly not. All scribes make mistakes, right? So I guess, sorry, that's my hope would be that what happens to text types is they fade, and that scholars learn to work without them.
Oh, very good. All right, Dr. Robinson, the last word is yours.
Well, still talking about that verse, the difference would be, again, if you're looking at the omission of it from some manuscripts or the inclusion from some manuscripts, like I said, the presence or the absence is the best way to deal with it. We're agreed that homoiotoluton is the most logical explanation, but are text types still valuable? It goes back to what I was saying about the clustering. If we have these textual clusters and you want to call them by the traditional text type labels, that's fine. So if you want to say Alexandrian cluster, that's fine with me. But when you're looking at the ones that are omitting, the manuscripts omitting the verse, either omitted directly by their own occurrence, scribal blunder of homoiotoluton, or it's going back to a common ancestor. And I think the text types are important in this regard, that you can say, well, look, Aleph, B, L, especially, that are leaving out that verse 26, probably do derive from a common ancestor. And you can add to that some of the other more Alexandrian manuscripts as well. And I think it doesn't say, well, by doing so, we're reducing the Alexandrian cluster. We're just saying it goes back to a very early error that was made. And the error permeated through the later transmission of Alexandrian manuscripts. And that is actually, for the transmissional history viewpoint, more important than just saying, well, maybe each scribe independently made exactly the same homoiotoluton error. They could have, but the odds are probably against it based upon the grouping into textual clusters. So yes, I do think the idea of textual clusters, or if you want to call them text types, still has importance, as long as you aren't playing them off against each other, like in the Stirrs method, or trying to say that they have to go back to recensions or something like that. So I think there still is an importance. I think they're valuable. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't mind using them. I just don't think that in this case, Metzger happened to give the best definition of what was going on in this particular variant.
Well, Dr. Gurry and Dr. Robinson, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think we were just about an hour and a half here, and we got lots of good stuff, lots of very informative things. So I think those who are tuning into the channel will have some more insight onto the current thinking of text types. So thank you so much for spending the time with me here on the channel.
Glad to be with you, Dwayne. Thanks for having us.
All right.
Also, I would just like to say that was a very good conference we had, and Dr. Gurry is going to be editing the conference volume of papers that will come out in a year and a half, however long it'll be. Everybody should get a copy.
All right, there we go. I put a link in the description below, but I don't know if I'm going to remember to come back in a year and do that. Good.